From her very first film, Lauren Bacall found herself caught in a disturbing love triangle involving her director, Howard Hawks, and her co-star, Humphrey Bogart. Years later, when Hawks was asked what had really happened, his answer was brutally blunt. For him, the purpose of being in the theater was simple. Never let it feel stale, no matter how many times you do it with the same woman. The remark exposed the harsh, unsentimental mindset of Hollywood's golden age. With her fatal gaze and iconic deep voice, Bacall quickly became a fixture of classic cinema. Her life reads like a checklist of Tinseltown's greatest achievements and scandals. Although she remained remarkably private for most of her life, in Hollywood, secrets never stay buried forever. In 1932, Bacall's parents divorced, and her father disappeared completely from her life. While this loss brought the young girl closer to her mother, it also left lasting emotional scars. Interviews and accounts from those who knew her suggest that Bacall's feelings toward her absent father were far from warm. By the time she reached high school, her ambitions were already clear. She wanted to be famous. But this desire was not merely about attention. Bacall genuinely loved acting and was a devoted fan of both stage and screen, with Bette Davis among her greatest early idols. From a young age, her path seemed set, driven by passion, ambition, and unresolved wounds that would quietly follow her into stardom. At just 13 years old, Lauren Bacall went to the movies to see Bette Davis star in Marked Woman, and that film quietly introduced her to a new idol, Humphrey Bogart. Sitting in the darkened theater, Bacall was completely captivated. She turned to a friend and confessed, "I'm crazy about that man, just crazy about him." What sounded like a teenage crush would later feel strangely prophetic. As a struggling young actress, Bacall took whatever work she could find, modeling when possible and even briefly working as a theater usher. Then, at 18, her life shifted when she became a model for Harper's Bazaar. The cover caught the attention of socialite Slim Keith, who found Bacall intriguing enough to show the magazine to her husband, film director Howard Hawks. What followed was a bizarre twist of fate. Hawks asked his secretary to contact Bacall, but a misunderstanding led to something far more dramatic. Instead of a simple phone call, Bacall received a plane ticket to Hollywood, inviting her to audition for an upcoming film Hawks was developing. It was an unlikely, life-changing stroke of luck. Bacall had the look, but very little acting experience, just a few stage productions to her name. She admitted her nervousness to Hawks, but he saw it as an advantage. In his eyes, Bacall hadn't yet picked up the bad habits of other actresses, and that raw inexperience was exactly what made her so compelling. From the moment she began working with Hawks, it was clear he intended to shape Lauren Bacall as an actress from the ground up. During her very first screen test for To Have and Have Not, Bacall was so nervous that her entire body began to tremble. To steady herself, she instinctively lowered her chin and tilted her eyes upward toward the camera. What started as a way to control her fear unexpectedly created a sultry, magnetic pose, one that would become her signature look. It instantly impressed Hawks, and the executives at Warner Brothers convinced he had found something special. Hawks not only cast Bacall in the film but reworked the story, eliminating a love triangle and making her the sole romantic interest of a leading man. That leading man was none other than Humphrey Bogart, the very actor Bacall had idolized as a teenager. Hawks spent hours each day with her on set, often stepping away from the director's chair to personally coach her through scenes. If it seemed as though Hawks was paying an unusual amount of attention to his young protégé, it was because he was. Despite the fact that his own wife had discovered Bacall, Hawks, a notorious womanizer, set his sights on her. It was a familiar pattern for him, but this time, he misjudged the situation. Lauren Bacall had no interest in her boss. That didn't mean she was immune to falling for someone else. The chemistry between Bacall and Bogart was undeniable, and what audiences saw on screen soon ignited into real passion off-camera. There was only one complication. Bogart was married to actress Mayo Method. Still, Bacall was immediately drawn to him, and the feeling appeared to be mutual. One day after filming, Bogart leaned toward her and kissed her, a moment that quietly marked the beginning of a love story far more powerful than anything written in the script. After asking for her phone number, a 19-year-old Lauren Bacall scribbled it onto a matchbook and handed it to Humphrey Bogart, who was 44 at the time. At first, they kept their affair hidden, But under the watchful eye of a controlling director and the pressure of a jealous wife, secrecy became impossible. It quickly turned into a tense waiting game over who would uncover the truth first, and the answer was Howard Hawks. His reaction was explosive. Although Hawks had signed Bacall to a contract at the start of filming, he now threatened to destroy her career before it had even begun. Desperate, Bacall turned to Bogart for advice, and he, in turn, became furious over Hawks' erratic and possessive behavior. The conflict escalated into a full confrontation between the two men, growing so severe that production was shut down for 2 weeks. In the end, studio head Jack Warner was forced to step in and restore order. When To Have and Have Not was finally released, it wasn't an immediate box office smash, but one thing was clear: critics were captivated by Bacall. Just 8 days after the film's premiere, Bogart announced that he had moved out of the home he shared with his wife. Riding on the film's momentum, the studio pushed to reunite Bogart and Bacall on screen, and by the fall of 1944, they began work on The Big Sleep. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Bogart would smoothly transition from his troubled marriage into a future with Bacall. But then came a devastating turn. Only 11 days after announcing his separation, Bogart revealed he was reconciling with his wife, Mayo Method. The news shattered Bacall's heart. Determined to save his third marriage at all costs, Bogart chose to stay, at least for the time being. Yet the strain proved unbearable. As production on The Big Sleep paused for Christmas, Bogart returned home, standing on the edge of a breaking point that would soon change everything. Alcohol had always intensified the problems in Humphrey Bogart's marriage, and the holidays only pushed the tension further. This time, there was no turning back. Bogart finally left his wife for good and ran straight back to Lauren Bacall. On May 10, 1945, Bogart and Mayo Method's divorce was finalized, and just 11 days later, he married Bacall in a quiet ceremony on a friend's farm in Ohio. Many doubted the marriage would survive. After all, Bogart was entering his fourth marriage, and the couple were separated by a 25-year age gap. Yet overnight, Bacall found herself elevated into the highest circles of Hollywood society, unknowingly helping to coin a phrase that would later become legendary. Frank Sinatra's famous inner circle, known to history as the Rat Pack, actually began as Humphrey Bogart's group of drinking companions. Bogart embraced the name after Bacall, attempting, and failing, to scold the rowdy crew, dismissed them as a damn rat pack. While the atmosphere on the set of To Have and Have Not had been tense and chaotic, The Big Sleep marked a turning point. Hawks, Bacall, and Bogart set aside past conflicts, united by a shared determination to outdo their first collaboration. The result was a massive success. The Big Sleep became a smash hit and remains one of the most critically praised examples of film noir to this day. Bacall and Bogart had discovered a winning formula, and they repeated it, completing 4 films together in the early years of their marriage. During that time, Bacall chose to appear almost exclusively alongside her husband. More invested in Bogart than in building her own career, she turned down roles unless a script truly intrigued her. Whispers soon spread through Hollywood, labeling her as difficult or overly selective. In 1945, the Hollywood Women's Press Club even awarded her the runner-up title for Least Cooperative Actress. Yet Bacall undeniably had the golden touch. Nearly every film she agreed to make earned critical acclaim. Still, in just 6 years under contract with Warner Brothers, the studio suspended her 6 times, each punishment handed down for refusing roles. After years of conflict, Warner Brothers finally released Bacall from her contract in 1951. Even then, many directors failed to take her seriously, seeing her only as Mrs. Bogart. And while Bogart had endured 3 marriages without children, with Bacall, that would soon change. When pregnancy didn't happen right away, Bogart grew anxious and began taking hormone treatments in hopes of speeding things along. The results were unexpected and dramatic. He started losing his hair rapidly, and by the time he arrived to film his next project, he was completely bald. Still, the sacrifice wasn't in vain. In 1949, Lauren Bacall became pregnant and gave birth to their first child, Stephen Humphrey Bogart, named after Bogart's character in To Have and Have Not, the very film that had brought them together. Not long after, their second child, Leslie Howard Bogart, was born. At last, Bacall had the family she had always wanted. But, as she would learn, happiness in Hollywood was rarely permanent. Despite being one of the biggest stars in the industry, Bacall carried a deeply personal secret she worked hard to keep out of the spotlight. She identified as Jewish throughout her life, yet the pressures of Hollywood forced her to downplay her faith to protect her career. Even Bogart encouraged her to have their children baptized as Christians, believing it would make life easier for them in a less tolerant America. And if studio boss Jack Warner assumed Bacall would fade after leaving his studio, he was badly mistaken. Her first film after becoming a mother, How to Marry a Millionaire, featured an all-star cast including Marilyn Monroe and Betty Grable and became a massive hit in the early 1950s. With renewed success, Bacall was invited to leave her handprints and footprints in cement at Grauman's Chinese Theater, one of Hollywood's highest honors. To everyone's surprise, she declined, insisting she didn't yet see herself as a true major star. As Bacall prepared to headline a new string of films at 20th Century Fox, Bogart also severed ties with Warner Brothers, choosing instead to form his own production company. In 1955, while planning his next major project, Bogart began experiencing severe throat pain and difficulty swallowing. Bacall urged him to see a doctor, and when he finally did, the diagnosis was devastating: esophageal cancer. With tensions mounting at home, acting became an emotional refuge for Bacall. During Bogart's illness, she delivered a critically acclaimed performance in Designing Woman, even as doctors worked tirelessly behind the scenes to fight the disease that was slowly taking her husband away. Doctors performed an extreme operation, removing Humphrey Bogart's esophagus, 2 lymph nodes, and even a rib. Despite the severity of the surgery, it wasn't enough. Chemotherapy followed, along with additional procedures, and soon Bogart could barely manage the stairs in his own home. Nearly a year after his diagnosis, he slipped into a coma. The next day, the inevitable happened. Humphrey Bogart died at just 57 years old, his body so ravaged by disease that he weighed barely 80 pounds. Lauren Bacall was shattered. For an entire year she had devoted herself to his care, clinging to hope that he would recover. Now, at only 32, she was a widow with 2 young children, suddenly cut off from the only emotional anchor she had ever truly known. To Bacall, it felt as though time had stopped, yet the world kept moving, leaving her lost and numb. In that fragile state, someone stepped in, seeing both her pain and her isolation: Bogart's longtime friend, Frank Sinatra. He began inviting her to dinners and gatherings with familiar faces, easing her back into a social circle she wasn't ready to face alone. Afraid of being left alone with her grief, Bacall accepted. Gradually, friendship blurred into something deeper. Bacall later admitted that even though she felt emotionally adrift, she couldn't deny the chemistry between herself and Sinatra. They dated for several months, and then he proposed. Just days later, however, Sinatra abruptly and coldly ended the relationship. The reason was scandal. Although the couple wanted to keep the engagement secret, Bacall confided in a friend, who passed the information to powerful gossip columnist Luella Parsons. By the next morning, the engagement was splashed across the front pages. Sinatra, furious and convinced Bacall had leaked the story herself, ended things immediately. After losing Bogart, Bacall had already distanced herself from Hollywood, returning to her hometown of New York. There, she purchased an apartment in the storied Dakota Building. It was in New York that she met actor Jason Robards, then starring on Broadway and in the process of divorcing his second wife. Their connection was immediate, and soon they were engaged. The romance moved at breakneck speed, but it took 3 attempts for Bacall to legally marry her second husband. In 1961, the Austrian government refused to grant them a marriage license for their planned wedding in Vienna. Shockingly, they were also turned away in Las Vegas. Finally, the couple drove all the way to Mexico to marry, nearly a month later than planned. The urgency had a reason: Bacall was pregnant. Only months after their rushed ceremony, she gave birth to their son, Sam Robards. Once again surrounded by family, Bacall felt renewed. She thrived on the New York stage, quietly mapping her eventual return to film, even as another chapter of her life began to unfold. She couldn't ignore the cracks in her life forever. By 1968, Lauren Bacall could no longer look past what was happening inside her own home. Jason Robards' drinking had spiraled completely out of control, and for the first time since she was 19 years old, Bacall made a decision that terrified and freed her at the same time. She chose to be alone. After 7 years of marriage, she divorced Robards. The choice was painful, but it was also liberating, and Bacall felt ready to rise on her own. Beyond their son Sam, there was one lasting gift from that marriage. Robards was a serious stage actor, and through him, Bacall rediscovered her love for the theater. On stage, she finally found something she had long been missing: true artistic fulfillment and a new sense of confidence. In 1970, she won a Tony Award for her performance in Applause, playing a role first made famous on screen by her childhood idol, Bette Davis. The moment came full circle when Davis herself attended one of the performances and went backstage afterward to congratulate Bacall in person. It was an encounter Bacall would never forget. She continued working steadily for decades, remaining just as selective with her roles in the 1980s and 1990s as she had been in her early career. Then, after more than 50 years in the industry, Bacall received the surprise of a lifetime. In 1996, she appeared in a supporting role in the romantic comedy The Mirror Has Two Faces, earning her first, and only, Academy Award nomination. She won the Golden Globe, and many believed the Oscar was finally hers, only to lose in a shocking upset to Juliette Binoche. Though disappointed, Bacall was later honored with an Academy Honorary Award in 2010, just 1 month before her 90th birthday. Not long after, Bacall suffered a stroke and passed away at her longtime Manhattan home. For much of her life, she had been a guarded and mysterious figure, but in her later years, she began revealing truths she had kept buried for decades. She admitted that rejecting Howard Hawks had enraged him, especially after he discovered her affair with Humphrey Bogart. Years later, Hawks coldly remarked that Bogart had fallen in love with the character Bacall played, and that she had spent the rest of her life playing it. Bacall herself confessed that after Bogart's death, she was utterly lost without him, haunted by nightmares and waking up screaming long after he was gone. At Bogart's funeral, Bacall made one final, devastatingly personal tribute. She placed a small whistle inside his coffin, a gift he had once given her, inspired by To Have and Have Not, the film that brought them together. It echoed the famous line from the movie, "You know how to whistle, don't you, Steve? You just put your lips together and blow." Bogart had engraved it with the words, "If you need me, just whistle." It was a farewell not just to a husband, but to the great love of her life, and the story that had defined them both.